Well, you don't get out of it by staying inside an escalatory trap. And I think he's trapped. He's trapped by his own rhetoric. He's trapped by his major donors to his campaign who effectively bought the White House for him. And they happen to be so-called Zionist billionaires. And one of the deals I think that was struck before he was finally elected was that if we get you to the White House, you will settle matters with Iran. That's the price of your presidency. So on the one hand, I think you're right. He's concerned about midterms. He's concerned about the impact here at home, but he's not more concerned about that than he is about his relationship with his donors and the position he's in right now vis-a-vis Israel. Now we know that most of the oil that we're concerned about these days is not just oil for gasoline. You're talking about petrochemical feedstocks, aviation fuel, grid balancing, fertilizers, and without these, you get production shutdowns. And right now, everything's shutting down. And I don't see how he reverses that quickly. You know, the Chinese are very interested in seeing this end because 50% of the oil that they buy comes from the Persian Gulf. Now, 13% of their total oil inventory is purchased from Iran, but they're just as concerned about the oil infrastructure on the west side of the Persian Gulf. I think that's one of the reasons that the Iranians said they would entertain a ceasefire discussion. But as you see, things aren't working very well. In the meantime, I think because you told me you wanted to talk a little bit about de-dollarization, I think we have to understand that in the Middle East and North Africa, the states that are there are now de-dollarizing. And of course, Russia has led that particular crusade for a very long time. China, even though it's the 500-pound gorilla inside BRICS, it nevertheless has followed the Russian lead. And I think we have to understand that right now, this de-dollarization has proceeded to find its way into the Persian Gulf. If you want to get anything out of the Gulf and you're not associated with the United States or Israel in any way, you're going to have to pay for the oil in yuan or rupees or rubles or any number of other currencies. In other words, anything but the dollar. And if we ultimately preside over the destruction of all the oil infrastructure, which I think is where we're headed, then that is going to finish off the petrodollar once and for all. Because the infrastructure inside the United Arab Emirates and the other small statelets from Kuwait all the way down to Iran are all in bad shape. They could be finished off by the Iranians quite easily. And if we attack the Iranian oil infrastructure, if we attack their desalination plants, they will do the same on the other side. And that'll be the end. And you can stop any oil from being pumped across Saudi Arabia very easily. Everybody knows where those pipelines run. So you don't have to attack the port of Jeddah or anything else on the Red Sea. All you have to do is hit the pipelines. That also will happen, and that'll finish off Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. And if Trump basically has to choose between his voter base, the US, or his donor base, why at his age would he choose his donor base? I mean, at that age, you want to leave a legacy, right? You want to be remembered as a proper person or like a great president and not someone who chose the wrong side, basically.
Yeah, except that you're now imputing something to him that I don't think is there. It's called rationality.
Or honor or humanity or something like that.
I don't think he's concerned about anything but winning. And in his mind, he has to have a quote unquote win. You're talking about a man who's never been held accountable for anything. How do you go through as a billionaire 6 bankruptcies and come out with billions of dollars? Stop and think about that. He is hostage to these Zionist billionaires. So he's going to do what they want. And unfortunately, you do have a lot of people in the United States who are easily swayed by utter nonsense. I mean, you've seen the things that have been said about the Russians in the press all over Europe. Well, imagine something like that here, only it's all about China and it's all about Iran or anybody else that the Israel lobby doesn't like for whatever reasons. Remember, the Israel lobby is not the one that is necessarily directly depositing money to people in Congress or the White House. It's the Zionist billionaires do that for them. So I think he, in his own mind, probably absolutely identifies his supporters with his views on Israel. And this is I think this is the key thing that nobody ever brings up. We are not, contrary to popular belief, involved in this war because Iran presents an existential threat to the United States. It doesn't. Absolutely does not, never has. Number two, we have had what I would call uneasy and sometimes hostile relations over the last 47 years. But if you look at the reason for most of these hostilities, it is Israel and Israel's determination to destroy Iran. Third, you've got to look at the Greater Israel Project. The Greater Israel Project is not just about territory, although that's a big part. You've seen the maps, you know where it runs, and they end up controlling half of Lebanon or more, half of Syria, the top 30% or so of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Sinai, and part of the West Bank of the Nile, believe it or not. But it's also about guaranteeing Israeli Jewish supremacy through the region. The only state at this point that has stood up to the Israeli supremacists is Iran. Everyone else has retreated. Everyone else has ultimately bowed out, sat nervously on the sidelines, and agreed to go along. Iran has not. So Iran must be destroyed as the last obstacle to total Israeli Jewish supremacy over the whole region. Now, behind that are people, of course, in London and in New York City who are keenly interested in wresting control of the oil resources away from Iran. Remember, Khuzestan is right on the border with Iraq. They would like to have control of those. And this goes back to the 1990s. If you look at the works of people like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, they were always talking about we had to gain control of all these oil resources as a means of controlling China because China depends on it. Well, in reality, it was always about Israel. We have to control all these resources, and that's the way we will make Israel great again. And I think that's Trump's view of everything. And he doesn't see any daylight between the interests of the United States and the interests of Israel, which is why they made him president. But there is huge daylight. And that's why if you look at his polling numbers have gone through the floor. He's down in the mid to low 30s. I predict it will sink into the 20s because here at home, our position financially and economically is deteriorating.
So what about the Gulf states then, especially UAE and also Saudi Arabia? I don't understand why they're also apparently are pushing so hard for this war, even though it's economic suicide. I mean, if this continues for much longer, you can kiss goodbye to Dubai. This whole concept of Dubai being a safe haven, it was an artificial place to begin with, but I don't see how Dubai can survive if this lasts for a few more months. I mean, of course, they have a lot of reserves still, like a few hundred billion in these slush funds. But in the end, if their business model doesn't survive in the long run, that country won't survive.
That's exactly right.
So why did they push for war?
Like Israel itself, if you go from Israel to Jordan down to the Emirates, just follow that line. All the states that you're discussing are artificial constructs.
Yeah.
They're a product of the First World War and British and French imperialism. You know, Churchill's famous comment, he said, no, Jordan, not a bad job for an afternoon. In other words, he sat down and drew the lines that now represent the state of Jordan in an afternoon. So all of these places are effectively artificial. There are three things happening right now. Number one, Iran is going to control the Persian Gulf. Preventing that, stopping that, reversing that is damn near impossible. In fact, I think it is. All right. That's unacceptable to us because we have de facto controlled the Gulf since the British left. The British left, we stepped in. For a while, we thought the Shah could step into our shoes and help control the Gulf for the West and the banking system. That failed. But now Persia, Iran really does have control of the Gulf. That's unacceptable. No one in the West, or at least that's the attitude at this point, can accept that. Even though if you go back to the Dardanelles, the strait that runs from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. After World War I ended, we gave control of the strait to the Turks. But we had a treaty called the Montreux Convention. That Montreux Convention is very important because it stipulates what everyone can and cannot do, including the Turks, which the Turks signed and agreed to. We haven't had any problems, but we refuse to treat Iran as a legitimate status quo actor. We insist on treating Iran as though they were a semi-Bolshevik state bent on conquering the world, which it is not, but that's the view, and that's what we insist on. So that's the first thing. Secondly, our own dollar is tied up with all the states that are artificial. And you're right. If we and the Iranians do not come to some sort of agreement on this ceasefire, and that has to include Israel, if that cannot be achieved, and we go back on the offensive against Iran, we are going to attack Iran's oil infrastructure and probably its desalination plants and anything else we can find that's of value. That's not going to win the war. It's not going to change the outcome because everything that counts is currently beyond our reach. It's either underground or it's mobile or it's protected by decoys. And they've also managed now to improve upon their air defense. So that means Iran will strike back and wipe everything out, and that's the end of all of those states. They will be finished.
Exactly.
Done.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not a. I talked to you. I talked to some other former generals here in Holland, but you don't need to be a whiz kid or to. I mean, this is something you can see in advance, right? If that the fact that the president or that the U.S. is sort of surprised by the fact that Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, like anyone could with just some brain could see that coming, right? I don't understand the naivety of the whole war, and also for these Gulf states, they could have also seen this coming, so they're shooting themselves in the foot.
Look, the German general staff told Adolf Hitler, this was probably about December of 1940, when he was pushing this planning for Barbarossa for the invasion of the Soviet Union. They said, look, this can't be done. The Soviet Union is too big. It's too large. And Hitler's response was, oh, that doesn't matter. The Soviets failed miserably to fight the Finns effectively. They're not any good. They've killed all their officers. And the general staff came back and said, there are no roads. There are very few rail lines. There are very few habitable places, as Russia is a nation of villages and cities with bad roads, and pointed out that half the German army was able to refuel at gas stations all across Western Europe. I said, you can't do that inside Russia. He said, oh, don't worry about that. The Russians really aren't any good. And some of these men had fought in World War I. And they said, no, the Russians are actually pretty good soldiers. They're not always well led, but don't underestimate the Russian soldier. Well, we know the rest of the story. He waved it off. He said, oh, no, you're wrong. Well, I think we've had the same thing happen with Donald Trump. Donald Trump listened selectively. Politicians do this. I always say presidents get the generals they want.
Yeah.
Who is the man who is at the top of the paradigm right now? An Air Force general. What does the Air Force believe as an institution? What does it do its members believe? They ultimately believe, as an article of faith, that air power can win everything. And they've been trying to demonstrate that since the 20s, that air power can win all wars. And if you challenge that, they'll come back at you with a vengeance. And it's all about targets and target lists and how many targets you get. And if you just bomb long enough, you will win. And you won't need an army, you won't need a navy, you won't need anything else, and everyone will surrender to you. That's what he's got running the show. Now, I'm not saying the man is stupid. He's an intelligent man. And I think he's probably, of those that are out there, maybe one of the more operationally solid. But the problem is, he wasn't someone who was going to stand up and say, you know, this isn't going to work. Everyone who's tried it in the past has failed. You're dealing with a state that's too large for air power to be successful. You're talking about targets that may or may not make any difference. Air targeting is not a strategy. And when the targets run out, the war doesn't end. But nobody said that. And so Donald Trump listened to two people. He listened to his chairman, I'm sure, of the Joint Chiefs, and then he listened to Mr. Netanyahu. And the Israelis said, oh, this will be over quick. You know, they'll collapse after a few days of violent bombing. Well, we'll kill all the top leaders. And we've adopted, tragically, this sort of sick mentality that says, murder everyone in charge and you'll win the war. And what Stalin did without realizing it when he shot 50,000 officers in the Soviet armed forces is that he opened up senior positions to younger men who in many cases were not only more energetic, in many cases they were more competent. So you ended up improving the situation. So, you know, it's really disappointing to listen to all of this and hear all of it. But we have no influence over our own government. And I think millions of Americans who voted for Trump voted against any more wars.
Yeah, exactly.
And they wanted him to do something about the domestic situation in which there has been a breakdown in law. We opened the borders. We let in millions of people that we know nothing about, and large numbers of them are criminals, but worse, they're a burden on our society. We're paying them money. We're paying for their sustenance. We're paying for their health care. Now we want to pay for their children to go to school. And our experience with most of these unwanted migrants is that they never become Americans. They don't want to be Americans. They didn't come here to be Americans. In fact, we're finding they came here to be whatever they are and live from our largesse. So the bottom line is that's what people were really focused on. They wanted action taken there. He's failed miserably on those counts.
Yeah, and also by threatening to destroy the civilization, and also by attacking power plants, desalination plants, but also factories that the Iranians need also after this war is over to be productive. If you destroy all that, you will definitely make sure people will rally behind the flag. So the regime change is not going to be effective. I guess maybe he was hoping for like a Venezuela scenario where that was perhaps a victory for him, like that was relatively smooth. Maybe something like that he was expecting or counting on in Iran as well. Do you think?
Potentially, who knows? But the problem is that Venezuela is not a vassal state of America. Nothing changed in Venezuela except the top person and his wife were kidnapped and sent to the United States to be tried for whatever number of crimes we accuse them of. The state itself is intact. All the people that we said were unacceptable to us who were involved in the drug and human trafficking, they're all there. Nothing's changed.
Nothing changed.
And as far as control over the petroleum, we're now allowing them to sell petroleum to pretty much anybody they want. So I think Donald Trump is about optics. He wants to look good. He wants things to appear as though he has done something great. Well, he picked the wrong enchilada with Iran. Iran is a real nation with a history that goes back 2,700 years as Persia. And it's not going away. It's not going to surrender. It's not going to surrender its sovereignty, most important, to Israel, which is really what this is all about. You must stop enriching uranium. You must dismantle your theater and tactical ballistic missile force. You must stop cooperating with your co-religionists in the region. Well, they're not going to do that. It's not so much, and contrary to popular belief, you know, Mr. Netanyahu has been telling us for how many years now, how many decades that Iran is 2 weeks away from a nuclear weapon. They've never been that close, and they haven't wanted it. But I fear that now, with new leadership in place, they will definitely have a nuclear weapon, because the real lesson from this war for the whole world is if you don't have a nuclear weapon, you are at the mercy of the United States.
Yeah, but maybe they have an even better weapon, the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe they don't even need a nuclear weapon. They can just turn on or off the strait.
Well, I think that's true, but they're not fools. They know that has consequences over time, and that's why they have said, you know, to India, to Japan, to China, to Korea, to all of the people that need oil for all the petroleum products that you can think of and are building plastics and need helium for microcircuitry and so forth. You can move through the Strait of Hormuz as long as you pay for what you're taking out with something other than dollars. They prefer yuan, but they'll take something else. And, you pay the fee, whatever we want, because they want to use that money to rebuild their country after this atrocity is over. So I don't think the Iranians are unrealistic. I don't think they're fools. And I think they're more rational than we are.
And what about this argument or this narrative that you hear often from coming from Israel and also the evangelicals in the U.S. is that the Ayatollahs in Iran they're waiting for the 12th Imam to reappear and for the holy war to start and end of times. Like, is that? I mean, I've read up on it, and it does seem like the clerics in Iran have this faith that. The Mahdi will come eventually, will reappear, and it will eventually then lead to end of times and holy war and everything. How do you see that? Is that completely exaggerated then from the side of Israel?
Well, let's go to the Iranians first of all. One of the things that I think has happened in Iran over the last 47 years is that the widespread popular support for Islam as practiced inside Iran has dramatically scaled back. I mean, frankly, we need to understand that from the standpoint of many people in Iran, Islam was always an Arab import. It's not organic to Persia. So I think you have a lot more people. I don't know, how you would estimate it. Some people have told me more than 50% of the population is largely disinterested in the religion. One of the things that clearly was true is that the mosques are largely empty. They're not being heavily trafficked. Women are now not all running around in bags, although we try to portray it as though everyone inside Iran is running around in one of these black outfits. That's not true. The social mores have been relaxed. The expectations of the government are not what they were. So somebody took me aside a couple of days ago who's been there many times and drew on a map with a red pencil and said, look at these neighborhoods in Tehran, which is a very, very large city, as you know, millions of people. These are the neighborhoods that are populated by effectively upper and middle class people who are well educated, who are very, very opposed to the theocracy, but they are Iranian nationalists. In other words, they believe in their country, they love their country. They don't want to shoot people who are in charge, but they do want change. I said, well, that's very gratifying. She said, yes, but you need to understand something. The people in these neighborhoods are now largely dead. I said, really, why? Because you've bombed them. We leveled those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
How stupid.
Yeah.
How utterly stupid. I think had we done nothing and let Iran alone, that within the next year or so, you would have seen dramatic political change in Iran on its own. We went through this in Serbia. The whole, I don't say it all was, but a large part of what went on with the bombing campaign for concerning Kosovo was really about bombing Milosevic out of office. People in Washington had a grudge. They wanted to get rid of Milosevic. What happened when you bombed the Serbs? The Serbs united. So when did Milosevic finally go away? Well, he went away almost a year later as a result of people inside the country. Undoubtedly, we had color revolutionaries involved, but the truth is the majority of Serbs had pretty much had it with Milosevic and were ready to get rid of him. What would have happened had we not bombed Serbia? Well, I mean, that's another question, but we seem to be enamored of this idea that you can enforce regime change and social change and cultural change with bombs. It hasn't worked very well.
Uh-huh.
So right now, Iran is more cohesive, more unified than it's ever been in its history. And all of the assumptions about Iran have proven to be fundamentally wrong. There are estimates out there that they have between 15 and 20,000 missiles left. There are estimates that they can produce 50 to 100 new missiles every month in underground manufacturing facilities. To that has to be added 45,000 or more remaining unmanned systems or drones. So the notion that, well, Iran is finished, they're running out of missiles, they're running out of drones. We've been hearing this for weeks. Very similar to, oh, well, the Russians are collapsing. They've run out of ammunition. They can't do anything. On and on and on. All of this has turned out to be nonsense. And so you go back to the drawing boards and you sit down with your subordinates that are in command. You have a Navy admiral in command in CENTCOM, and you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who's an Air Force officer, and you say, what do we do? Well, we've been over the targets and we found some new targets. We think we have a way to get to this and this and this. This time it'll work. We just have to intensify and keep it up.
Yeah.
That's where we're headed. It doesn't matter what happens in Islamabad. We're going to go back to war again.
Yeah, I'm afraid. I'm afraid so too. What do you think about BRICS? Because to me, the US looks weak at the moment, but at the same time, BRICS Plus also looks weak and divided because Iran and Saudi Arabia were both part of BRICS Plus. We see India or Modi hugging Netanyahu, so there's not a lot of unity there for me as a layman to see.
Well, you got to be careful about Modi and whom he hugs. All right.
He's a hugger in general.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that Prime Minister Modi missed an opportunity to offer up New Delhi as a platform for the negotiations. It should have happened early on because he has good relations with Iran as well as good relations with Israel. Just because Modi goes to Israel and kissy face huggy bods with our friend Netanyahu doesn't mean that he's anti-Iranian. He absolutely is not. And the Indians were among the first to go and negotiate directly with Iran over the use of the strait. And they are moving oil, or at least they were until the announcement today that they've shut down the strait again. They were moving oil and basically paying the toll, whatever it is, and happy with the outcome because India is desperately dependent upon Persian Gulf, not just for the gasoline, but for diesel and all the other byproducts and chemicals. So I think I wouldn't attach too much significance to that. The other thing is when you look at the global South is very much aligned with Moscow and Beijing because they see us as, and I'm talking about Washington, as treating them essentially with contempt. And in fact, I would go one step further. I've never been an advocate for NATO in perpetuity. I thought we should have disengaged largely from Europe in the 1990s. And I think we had an opportunity then, and we still had an opportunity under President Trump to say, look, you're going to have to provide the Army 4-star or whatever he turns out to be as a European. You've got to Europeanize the structure. We can't be your first responder. We're going to stay in NATO. We'll continue to support you as well as we can. But you need to take the lead now. You need to be responsible for yourselves and your own security and so forth. We didn't do that. Instead, we were very happy to stay in Europe because we treated Europeans the way the Romans treated the Greeks. If you go back to the Roman Empire, everyone admired Greek civilization, language, and culture. Americans regard Europe as the fountainhead of their civilization. But the Romans got tired of the Greeks because they kept fighting among themselves and they caused trouble. So they essentially went over there with some legions, put down the rebellions and said, it's over. Shut up. You're now part of the Roman Empire. You will provide a couple of legions trained and equipped the way ours are, and you will do what we say. Well, effectively, that's the way we've treated you. I mean, this fanciful notion that you should join us in impaling yourselves on the Strait of Hormuz is absurd. But this is the assumption. Well, we've been protecting you for years. Well, not really, because no one in Russia has been interested in threatening Europe, certainly not since the mid to late 80s, and definitely not since Putin became president. That's utter nonsense. But we feed Europeans this nonsense, and they eagerly believe it. But what they don't understand is they're essentially vassalizing themselves. Now, Trump has turned around and said, well, if you're not going to do what we say, we don't like you anymore. We'll leave. Well, the Europeans ought to cheer and say, go, get out. I always go back to the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan. And Macmillan was approached first by Kennedy, subsequently by Johnson. And they said, we want you to join us in Vietnam. And Sir Harold Macmillan was no fool. He said, why? We have no interest in Vietnam. We don't think you should go into Vietnam. Yeah. We think it's a mistake. And we were very angry. But we didn't want to divorce ourselves at that point from the British or anybody else. We saw value in it. We were afraid of the Soviet threat, on and on and on. Well, at this point, we should both be grateful Trump should be grateful that the Europeans don't want to be involved because the Europeans need to take the lead for their own national security. Europeans should be grateful that they're not being dragged into this disaster.
But the military-industrial complex is not going to be happy if the NATO in the end is being dismantled, right? Because that also means that Europe is going to focus on their own defense industry, so it means less business for the military-industrial complex. So how does that come into play here?
Well, I think you're right. And that's a problem for us. And it's something that President Eisenhower, before he left office, warned us could happen in the future. If you look at our manufacturing base, much of it has been exported to places like China and Vietnam and Mexico and so forth. But our military manufacturing base is still largely intact. It's not as large as it once was. It does not have a surge capability, which means it can't rapidly ramp up and produce more of everything. But it's a substantial chunk of what we call our manufacturing base, and Congress is hostage to it. It's the same thing with defense spending. If you look at most of our defense spending, it has nothing to do with what we need and everything to do with where the money goes on the Hill. You know, how much money goes to Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, because there are bases in these places and manufacturing facilities. So it's our problem, not yours. And we do need to address it. And I think it will be addressed because I think we're headed into very, very serious financial territory right now.
Yeah, I agree. And to me, the whole war in the Middle East is starting to look like a global world war because China and Russia are providing intelligence, also equipment. So all the big players seem to be involved. Maybe India not so much, but isn't it time for maybe also to include Russia to come to sort of some sort of grand deal where all these major conflicts are solved at once? So Putin gives in, Trump gives in, Iran gives in, and China is sort of then the peaceful player trying to arrange everything. If we have one, I'm being naive, I know, but it seems like everything is connected at this point. So if there could be the fortitude and the willingness amongst leaders to come to some sort of grand deal, would that be possible at all, you think, or realistic?
Well, let's look at the things that are really happening on the ground. First of all, understand that we represent a World War II force structure designed to wage some version of World War II. It's not working because Iran is part of a 21st century paradigm. What is that paradigm? It's the integration of overhead surveillance, intelligence, surveillance, platforms, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms in space, also at lower levels in the terrestrial environment. And they provide Iran with essentially not perfect information, but persistent surveillance. So Iran is able to essentially draw a line anywhere from 600 to 1,200 kilometers out from its border and turn everything within that range into a killing zone, because those overhead platforms are linked directly to hundreds of strike systems with thousands of missiles and unmanned systems. The only decision that has to be made is that once you see what's happening on the ground, you decide what kind of missile, what kind of unmanned system you're going to employ. But that's why the United States Navy is sitting hundreds of miles away from the Strait of Hormuz. That's why we are parking aircraft hundreds of miles away from Iran. In other words, we're being driven further and further and further away, which makes it that much harder for us to project power against Iran. Well, why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because we are primarily a maritime and an aerospace power. We are not a land power anywhere in the world but in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, we're a land power in North America. So we have a relatively small army. We have perhaps 450,000 men under arms in the United States Army. You would need at least 1 million men to even begin to think seriously about invading Iran. And then you would have to understand that the global climate for this sort of thing has changed. If the Chinese or the Russians decide to intercept us en route between the United States and the Persian Gulf, they can sink our ships. They can shoot down our planes. So the massive force that you moved in 1990 to the Gulf might never get to the Gulf at all. And if you do get to the Gulf, as soon as you're within range, you're going to come under fire. So the real question is, how do you survive the killing zone? We're not prepared to do that yet. Now, we're bombing the living daylights out of everything that we can find, but we're not finding everything. We're not hitting everything. We're hitting a lot of decoys, and we're discovering that most of what we really want to hit is underground. Well, how do you get to that? Well, you try to insert a special operations force on the ground. That didn't work out very well because they too are subject to persistent surveillance. In other words, this is a nut we're trying to crack with the weapons and devices of the past. It won't work.
Yeah.
And so we have no chance of, quote unquote, winning, per se, this thing. And you're right. The intelligent thing to do would be, well, let's sit down, talk to these people, and come up with a solution. And you should include other great powers, which is something we never want to do. We never want to include anybody else. We want to mandate everything. And if you go to Ukraine, you want to solve the Ukraine problem, well, the first thing you do is convene a conference that involves not just the United States and Russia and all the states on Ukraine's border. You'd also need to have Germany there. Whether or not you need France or Great Britain, that's another matter. But you have to bring together the interested parties. And you have to tell them, this is yours to solve. And you cannot say, as the vice president said yesterday, well, this war should have ended a long time ago. They're just disputing a few miles of territory here or there. I mean, that's an expression of extreme ignorance. Doesn't understand that this war did not begin yesterday. This was in the making for years, and it struck deep roots in history and culture and ethnicity. We didn't understand what happened in Yugoslavia. We didn't understand why Yugoslavia broke apart, because Americans have taken this position that, well, everybody everywhere is essentially the same, right? People really aren't different. They all need the same things. And you try to tell them, well, people may be very similar, but how they accomplish the tasks of staying alive and feeding themselves and living and so forth, that's called culture. And that changes radically from place to place. And people actually do care about what they are. They get up every morning, they look in the mirror, and they identify someone. You know, somebody said to me the other day, why do you think this Arab who was in the United States Army, he was an American citizen. He had been born in this country, but he was a Muslim Arab. And this happened a few years ago, and he suddenly went to work in the morning as a major in the Army. He was a physician, and he began shooting American soldiers. They said, how could this happen? Well, the answer was he woke up in the morning, he looked in the mirror, and he said, I'm a Muslim Arab. I mean, we dismiss this. Oh, that doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. We're all the same. It's crap. We've got serious problems here in the United States. You've got serious problems where you are. None of this has anything to do with the Gulf. And the Gulf can only make things worse. But again, you've got to go back to Israel. And Israel wants certain things. We can't produce those. And if we can't produce them, we should say we can't do that. You know, we should be interested in helping the Israelis come to some sort of accommodation with their neighbors. That's not bombing. You're not going to get that accommodation by threatening anybody. But that's where we are. We're stuck.
We are indeed stuck, Colonel. Thanks so much again for your time. Just to wrap up, anything else you want to add? Maybe the one thing was on my mind is there how high is the chance that Trump is going to be impeached?
I would say that, you know, if this goes on for another 2 or 3 weeks and produces the disaster that I think it could, which we've discussed already, which erases the Arabian Peninsula and the infrastructure there, he will not be impeached, but he could face removal under the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment of the Constitution provides for the opportunity inside the cabinet for cabinet members to collectively remove him from the presidency.
Yeah.
Now, the group that he has there now, they're all Israel firsters. All of them signed the oath, Israel first, when they took the job. They're not going to move unless the big donors decide that President Trump has become more of a liability than an asset. And I don't know when or if that will happen. But I think that's probably more likely than impeachment, because if nothing happens, there will be no impeachment, likely to be no impeachment until the fall or after the next election.
Yeah. Most of my viewers are American. Of course, there's a bunch of Europeans too, but I've noticed most of them are American. Anything you want to tell the American viewers to end the conversation with? Are you going to run for president? That's the one question I always get. Like, what's needed for Douglas to run for president? But
Well, the Americans need to convince everyone in their own country that our greatness is not served by attacking and bombing people in other countries. Our greatness does not rest on a foundation of interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. And our greatness is not enhanced by doing the bidding of Israel and its agents inside the United States. We need to be America first. And if we're America first, we can get along with everybody else because we should expect that the Russians are Russian first. The Iranians are Iranian first. The Dutch are Dutchman first. That's fine. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That does not necessarily mean violence. And you see, I think that's the big lie that's been proselytized in education, that any manifestation of nationalism, any defense of national identity, national culture, language, and so forth, is considered evil. It's not. It's actually a very positive thing. And what we found after World War II, we took all the various minorities that had been in other people's countries and we grouped them into countries. You used to have millions of Germans spread out all over Eastern Europe and down into the Balkans. After World War II, they were all forcibly shoved into this place called Germany and Austria. And we took the minorities that had formerly been in Poland and we put them elsewhere, and we made Poland Polish. Now, once you put all of the various tribal groups in their homelands, we tended to get peace. So this business of diversity needs to be understood. Yes, diversity is positive, but what kind of diversity are you talking about? And the diversity that we have in Europe today, I think, is different from what was envisioned in 1945. People simply said, we're not going to go down this path anymore with anybody that's going to start a war because some of their countrymen are on the wrong side of the border. And that was a smart move.